If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. Sharing it with your friends and family helps spread knowledge. And when we help others grow, we grow too. Thank you so much for listening. Let's dive into the podcast. Chapter 1. The Dream and the Race. Part 1. The Cold War Sparks a Space Race. On a crisp October evening in 1957, a tiny metal sphere began circling the Earth. Its name was Sputnik, and its simple beeping signal would shake America to its core. As families gathered around their radios to hear the alien sound passing overhead, many felt a chill that had nothing to do with autumn weather. The Soviet Union had just proved they could launch anything into space, including nuclear warheads. The shock hit hardest in Washington. America had always prided itself on technological superiority, yet suddenly, the enemy could literally look down on them from space. When President Eisenhower tried to reassure the nation by calling Sputnik a small ball in the air, critics mocked his response. The Soviets weren't finished showing off. They launched a dog named Laika into orbit, then bigger satellites, each success hammering home their advantage. The final blow came on April 12, 1961. Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit Earth. Americans watched helplessly as their rival claimed the ultimate prize. Newspapers ran headlines asking if America was falling behind in everything that mattered. Parents worried their children would grow up in a world dominated by communism. Military leaders feared the Soviets could soon drop bombs from space. This wasn't just about national pride anymore. The same rockets lifting cosmonauts could carry nuclear warheads across continents. Every Soviet space triumph demonstrated their military reach. American officials realized they faced an enemy who could strike from above, while claiming the moral high ground of peaceful exploration. Public anger forced politicians to act. Congress demanded answers about America's struggling rocket program. The Army, Navy, and Air Force had been developing separate space projects, creating wasteful competition instead of focused effort. Something had to change dramatically. In July 1958, President Eisenhower signed the law creating NASA. This new agency would unite America's scattered space efforts under civilian control. The message was clear. Space exploration was too important for military rivalry and bureaucratic games. Scientists like Wernher von Braun, the German rocket expert who had designed Nazi missiles but now worked for America, suddenly found themselves with new purpose and resources. The American people began paying attention to space like never before. Children who once dreamed of being cowboys now wanted to become astronauts. Universities expanded their science programs. Companies competed for NASA contracts. The nation was waking up to a new reality where the heavens had become the ultimate battlefield. What started as fear was transforming into determination. America had been caught sleeping, but now they were ready to fight back. The question was no longer whether they could catch up to the Soviets, but how quickly they could surpass them. The stage was set for the greatest technological race in human history. Part 2. JFK's bold promise to land a man on the moon. The stage was set for the greatest technological race in human history. But America needed something more than just determination. They needed a leader willing to make an impossible promise. On April 12, 1961, the Soviets struck again. Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit Earth, making his historic flight while America's best rocket had managed only a 15-minute suborbital hop. The news hit Washington like a thunderbolt. John F. Kennedy, barely 3 months into his presidency, found himself staring at another humiliating defeat in the space race. Kennedy gathered his advisors in the Oval Office. The room buzzed with tension and frustration. Vice President Lyndon Johnson paced near the windows. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara shuffled through budget papers. NASA Administrator James Webb sat quietly, waiting for direction. Everyone knew something dramatic had to be done. But what? the young president faced a brutal reality. America was losing badly in space, and the world was watching. Each Soviet success made the United States look weak and backward. Allies questioned American leadership. Enemies grew bolder. Something had to change, and it had to be big. Kennedy's advisors debated options for weeks. Some suggested matching Soviet achievements step by step. Others proposed focusing on military satellites or space stations. But Kennedy wanted something bolder, something that would capture imaginations and shift the entire game. He asked his team a simple question: is there any place we can catch them? Webb and his NASA colleagues studied the possibilities. A moon landing emerged as the one goal where America might actually win. The Soviets had advantages in existing rockets and experience. But getting to the moon would require such massive efforts that both nations would essentially start from scratch. It was America's best shot at victory. On May 25, 1961, Kennedy walked into the House chamber to address Congress. Television cameras carried his words around the world. His voice was clear and confident as he spoke the words that would define a decade. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. The reaction was immediate and mixed. Some congressmen applauded enthusiastically. Others sat in stunned silence, calculating the enormous costs. Scientists debated whether such a feat was even possible. The American public watched with fascination and worry. Kennedy had just committed the nation to spending billions of dollars they didn't have on technology that didn't exist. Many called him reckless, but the president understood something his critics missed. America needed an inspiring goal that would unite the country and focus their scattered efforts. The moon provided exactly that target. Budget battles erupted almost immediately. Congress demanded detailed cost estimates for a program that was essentially science fiction. NASA scrambled to create plans for missions they barely understood. Critics questioned every dollar, but Kennedy's words had already begun working their magic, transforming national mood from defensive embarrassment into offensive ambition. Part 3: NASA's Apollo Program, From Ambition to Reality. Kennedy's dramatic promise launched NASA into the biggest mobilization since World War II. The space agency suddenly found itself responsible for accomplishing something that sounded impossible with technology that barely existed. Within months, NASA administrators were drawing up plans that would reshape the entire organization. The agency needed to grow fast and grow smart. NASA established new centers across the country, each with a specific purpose. The Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston became the nerve center for human spaceflight operations. The Kennedy Space Center in Florida would launch the massive rockets. Huntsville, Alabama, became home to rocket development under the guidance of Wernher von Braun, the German engineer whose team had created some of the most powerful rockets ever built. Von Braun's Saturn V rocket became the heart of the Apollo program. Standing 363 feet tall and weighing 6.2 million pounds when fully fueled, it was unlike anything anyone had attempted before. The rocket needed to generate enough power to escape Earth's gravity while carrying 3 men and all their equipment to the moon. Von Braun's team worked around the clock, testing engines that could produce 7.5 million pounds of thrust. NASA hired over 400,000 people to work on Apollo, from rocket scientists to seamstresses who hand-stitched spacesuits. The Apollo spacecraft itself required 2 separate vehicles: a command module to carry the crew and a lightweight lunar module designed specifically for landing on the moon's surface. Every component had to work perfectly in the vacuum of space. The program suffered a devastating setback in January 1967 when 3 astronauts died in a fire during a ground test of Apollo 1. Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were trapped in their command module as flames consumed the oxygen-rich cabin. The tragedy forced NASA to completely redesign the spacecraft's safety systems and materials. Before attempting moon landings, NASA needed to master the basics of spaceflight. The Mercury program had proven Americans could survive in space. The Gemini missions taught astronauts how to dock with other spacecraft, walk in space, and stay in orbit for up to 2 weeks. Each mission revealed new challenges and solutions. Project managers like George Mueller brought military-style organization to the chaos of rocket development. They created schedules, coordinated thousands of contractors, and made sure every piece of hardware met exact specifications. The attention to detail was extraordinary. Even the pens used by astronauts required special testing. By 1968, the impossible was starting to look possible. Test flights were proving the Saturn V could reach space. Astronauts were training for lunar operations. The command and lunar modules were taking shape. What had begun as Kennedy's bold words was becoming real machines, real plans, and real hope that Americans might actually walk on the moon before the decade ended. Part 4. Training the first lunar astronauts, Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins. Now NASA needed more than machines and plans. They needed the right people to fly them. 3 men would carry the hopes of an entire nation: Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. Each brought unique skills that would prove essential when millions of miles separated them from any help. Neil Armstrong had spent years testing experimental aircraft that pushed the boundaries of flight. His calm demeanor masked nerves of steel. When problems arose, Armstrong thought clearly and acted quickly. His colleagues knew him as someone who could fly anything NASA could build. His experience with the dangerous X-15 rocket plane had taught him to stay cool when death lurked behind every decision. Buzz Aldrin brought scientific precision to the crew. His MIT doctorate in astronautics and his mastery of spacecraft rendezvous techniques made him invaluable. Aldrin could calculate orbital mechanics in his head and had written his thesis on methods for spacecraft to meet in orbit. His methodical approach balanced Armstrong's intuitive piloting. Where Armstrong relied on feel, Aldrin trusted numbers and procedures. Michael Collins rounded out the trio with steady professionalism. As the command module pilot, he would orbit alone while his crewmates walked on the lunar surface. Collins understood that his job required patience and precision. If something went wrong with the lunar module, he would be their only way home. The responsibility never seemed to rattle him. NASA's training program pushed all 3 men to their limits. They rode centrifuges that spun them at crushing speeds until they nearly lost consciousness. They flew in planes that created brief moments of weightlessness, learning to work while floating. Underwater training prepared them for the strange mechanics of moving in spacesuits. The astronauts spent countless hours in simulators that recreated every aspect of their mission. Flight controllers would suddenly announce system failures, forcing the crew to solve problems under pressure. They practiced manual landings until they could set down the lunar module with their eyes closed. They studied geology so they could collect the right samples on the moon's surface. The mental pressure was enormous. Every person on Earth would be watching. A single mistake could kill them or doom the mission. They trained in deserts and jungles, learning to survive if they landed in the wrong place. They memorized procedures for hundreds of potential problems. Months of this intense preparation welded 3 individuals into a single, focused team. Armstrong's leadership kept them steady. Aldrin's technical expertise solved complex problems. Collins's reliability ensured they could count on each other completely. By early 1969, they were ready. The training had transformed them from skilled pilots into something more, explorers prepared to risk everything for humanity's greatest adventure. Chapter 2: Launch and Voyage to the Moon. Part 1: July 16th, 1969. Liftoff from Kennedy Space Center. The morning of July 16th, 1969, arrived with Florida skies painted in soft orange and pink. At Kennedy Space Center, the massive Saturn V rocket stood waiting on Launchpad 39A, its white body gleaming against the dawn. Ice crystals formed on its hull as super cold fuel chilled the metal. Steam drifted from the rocket like breath on a winter day. More than 1 million people had traveled to witness this moment. They packed beaches, highways, and rooftops for miles around. Families spread blankets on sand dunes. Children sat on their father's shoulders, pointing at the distant rocket. Around the world, 650 million people gathered around television sets, waiting. Inside the crew quarters, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins ate their final breakfast on Earth in unusual quiet. The meal was simple: orange juice, steak, eggs, toast, and coffee. They knew this food would have to sustain them through the most dangerous hours of their lives. The weight of the moment pressed on everyone in the room. The three men suited up in their bulky white spacesuits. Each piece had to fit perfectly. One small leak could mean death in the vacuum of space. They walked slowly to the transfer van, their movements careful and deliberate. The short ride to the launch pad felt like traveling to another world. At the rocket, they rode an elevator up 320 feet to their tiny command module. The spacecraft was smaller than a large closet, yet it would be their home for the next 8 days. They squeezed inside and began final checks. Hundreds of switches, gauges, and buttons surrounded them. Below, crowds held their breath. In mission control, engineers watched dozens of computer screens. Everyone knew that thousands of things could go wrong. The rocket contained the explosive power of a small atomic bomb. If it failed, the astronauts would die instantly. At exactly 9:32 in the morning, the 5 massive engines at the bottom of the Saturn V roared to life. The sound was unlike anything most people had ever heard. It rattled windows 20 miles away. The rocket didn't move at first. It just sat there, flames shooting downward, fighting against Earth's gravity. Slowly, incredibly slowly, the giant rocket began to rise. It climbed faster and faster, trailing a column of fire and smoke. People on the beaches cheered and wept at the same time. This was the moment when 3 human beings left their home planet to visit another world. The rocket's first stage burned for just over 2 minutes before separating and falling back to Earth. The second stage fired, pushing the astronauts even faster. Each stage worked perfectly, exactly as planned. Within 11 minutes, Apollo 11 had reached Earth orbit, traveling at 17,500 miles per hour. The dangerous part was just beginning. Part 2: Earth orbit and Trans-Lunar injection burn. Now Apollo 11 was in space, but the real work was just beginning. The 3 astronauts found themselves racing around Earth every hour and a half, traveling at an incredible speed. From their small windows, they could see the blue planet spinning beneath them. Everything looked peaceful from up there, but inside the spacecraft, everyone was busy. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins had to check every system on their ship. They tested the radios, the computers, and the life support equipment that kept them alive. Each button and switch had to work perfectly. There would be no second chances once they left Earth behind. Mission Control in Houston watched every number on their screens, making sure nothing was going wrong. The most important moment was coming soon. The rocket's third stage still had fuel left in it. This fuel would push them away from Earth and toward the moon. The engineers called this the Trans-Lunar injection burn, but the astronauts knew it by a simpler name: the point of no return. For 2.5 hours, Apollo 11 circled Earth. The crew ran through their checklists over and over. Armstrong's voice was calm as he talked to Houston, but everyone could feel the tension building. This next engine burn had to be perfect. If something went wrong, they might never make it to the moon. Even worse, they might not make it home. Finally, Mission Control gave them the words they were waiting for. Apollo 11, you are go for TLI. The crew prepared for the burn. They were flying over the Pacific Ocean, on the dark side of Earth, when the rocket engine fired again. For 6 minutes, the engine pushed them faster and faster. The astronauts felt pressed back into their seats as their speed increased from 17,500 miles per hour to over 25,000 miles per hour. This was the fastest any human beings had ever traveled. When the engine finally stopped, they were no longer circling Earth. They were flying in a straight line toward the moon. The moment was both thrilling and terrifying. Armstrong later said it felt like crossing a bridge and then watching it burn behind you. There was no easy way back now. They had committed themselves to a journey of 240,000 miles through empty space. If anything went seriously wrong, Earth was too far away to help them. As Apollo 11 left Earth's gravity behind, the three men realized they had just become the first humans to truly leave their home planet. Part 3. Transposition, Docking, and Journey in Lunar Trajectory. 4 hours after leaving Earth's gravity, Armstrong faced the mission's first make-or-break moment. The command module had to separate from the rocket stage, flip around completely, and dock with the lunar module that was tucked away underneath. This wasn't just another procedure. If Armstrong couldn't pull off this delicate dance in space, the entire mission would end right there. The maneuver required perfect timing and steady hands. Armstrong fired small thrusters to push away from the massive rocket stage. Then came the tricky part. He had to turn the command module around 180 degrees and line up perfectly with the lunar module's docking port. One mistake could damage both spacecraft or leave them unable to connect. Back on Earth, Mission Control held its breath. The astronauts couldn't see the docking port clearly. Armstrong had to rely on instruments and his instincts. He eased the command module forward inch by inch. When the docking mechanism clicked into place, relief flooded through both the spacecraft and Houston. The Eagle was now attached and ready for its historic role. With this critical step complete, the real journey began. Apollo 11 was now flying through space at 25,000 miles per hour, carried by the moon's growing pull. The spacecraft became their entire world. 3 men lived in a space smaller than a large closet, surrounded by the endless black of space. Earth quickly shrank behind them. Within hours, their home planet looked like a small blue marble floating in the darkness. The sight struck all 3 astronauts powerfully. Collins later said it made him realize how fragile and precious Earth really was. Meanwhile, the moon grew larger each day, transforming from a distant disk to a world they could actually see. The crew settled into daily routines that would carry them through the 3-day journey. They ate meals from pouches, checked navigation systems, and talked regularly with Houston. These conversations became lifelines, connecting them to the world they had left behind. Mission Control tracked their every mile, ready to help if anything went wrong. During quiet moments, the astronauts gazed out their small windows at sights no human had ever witnessed. Stars blazed with crystal clarity, unfiltered by Earth's atmosphere. The sun was a harsh white disk in the black sky. Most remarkable was watching Earth and Moon together, 2 worlds separated by an ocean of emptiness. As the hours passed, tension slowly built. Each mile brought them closer to the mission's most dangerous moments. The moon's surface, once just a distant target, was becoming a real destination. Soon they would have to trust their lives to machines and skills that had never been tested beyond Earth's orbit. By their 3rd day in space, the moon filled their windows. The time for the final, most perilous phase was approaching fast. Part 4. Entering lunar orbit and preparing the Eagle. On July 19, 1969, Apollo 11 approached its most critical moment yet. The spacecraft hurtled toward the moon at thousands of miles per hour, and now everything depended on a single engine burn. If the calculations were wrong, if the engine failed, the crew would either crash into the lunar surface or fly past the moon into deep space forever. At exactly the right moment, the service propulsion engine roared to life behind them. The astronauts felt the familiar push against their backs as the spacecraft slowed down. This burn had to be perfect. Too little thrust, and they would miss lunar orbit entirely. Too much, and they would dive straight into the moon's surface. Mission Control held its breath as radio signals took nearly 3 seconds to travel between Earth and Moon. The engine shut off precisely on schedule. Apollo 11 was now captured by lunar gravity, becoming the first crewed spacecraft to orbit another world. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins were suddenly the most isolated human beings in history. They were 240,000 miles from home with no possibility of rescue if something went wrong. Through their small windows, the astronauts saw a landscape unlike anything on Earth. The moon's surface stretched endlessly below them. Covered in ancient craters and mountain ranges, there were no clouds, no weather, no signs of life, just gray dust and rock baked by the sun and frozen in shadow. The silence was complete, except for the hum of their life support systems. Collins piloted the command module, while Armstrong and Aldrin studied their landing site through telescopes. They had trained for months using photographs, but seeing the actual terrain was different. The surface looked rougher than expected. Boulders and ridges appeared everywhere. Finding a smooth spot to land the lunar module would be harder than anyone had imagined. The crew began final preparations for the most dangerous part of their mission. Armstrong and Aldrin floated through the tunnel connecting their command module to the lunar module Eagle. They powered up its systems, ran through countless checklists, and prepared for separation. Every switch position mattered. Every procedure had been rehearsed hundreds of times. Collins would remain alone in the command module, orbiting the moon every 2 hours. When Armstrong and Aldrin descended to the surface, Collins would lose radio contact with them for long periods. He would be completely alone, responsible for keeping their ride home ready and waiting. The weight of this responsibility pressed on all 3 men. As they completed their preparations, the magnitude of what lay ahead finally sank in completely. Tomorrow, 2 of them would attempt something no human had ever done. They would descend through empty space to land on an alien world. The risks were enormous, but so was the opportunity to make history. Chapter 3, Descent and Historic Landing, Part 1, July 20th, 1969, Undocking and Beginning the Lunar Descent. July 20th, 1969 arrived with electric tension crackling through the Apollo spacecraft. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin squeezed through the narrow tunnel, connecting the command module to the lunar module, leaving Michael Collins behind to maintain orbit around the moon. The cramped Eagle felt different now. This wasn't another practice run. At 1:47 p.m. Eastern Time, Armstrong's voice carried across 240,000 miles of space. The Eagle has wings. They had successfully separated from Columbia. Collins watched his crewmates drift away, knowing he would spend the next day completely alone while they attempted the impossible. The weight of isolation settled on his shoulders as he continued his solitary orbit. Inside the Eagle, Armstrong and Aldrin ran through their checklists with mechanical precision. Every switch, every reading, every system had to perform perfectly. There would be no second chances once they committed to powered descent. The lunar module had never been tested in actual landing conditions. Only simulations and educated guesses guided them now. Ground control watched their screens intently as telemetry data streamed back to Earth. Charlie Duke, a missions communication specialist, maintained steady contact while engineers monitored hundreds of systems simultaneously. Everyone understood the stakes. If something went wrong during descent, there was no rescue mission waiting. Armstrong oriented the Eagle so its windows faced the lunar surface. Below them, the moon's gray landscape rolled past in stark detail. Craters, rocks, and mysterious shadows created an alien terrain unlike anything humans had ever seen up close. This wasn't the romantic moon of poets. This was a harsh, unforgiving world that could easily become their tomb. The moment arrived for descent engine ignition. Armstrong's finger hovered over the button while Aldrin called out system readings. "Looks good," Aldrin confirmed. The engine fired with a gentle push, beginning their controlled fall toward the surface. What had been theory and training now became reality. As they descended, the computer guidance system began calculating their trajectory. But simulations could only prepare them so much. Real lunar gravity, actual surface conditions, and unexpected variables would soon test every skill they possessed. The Eagle responded differently than expected, its movements slightly sluggish in the moon's weak gravitational field. Mission Control held its collective breath. Months of preparation, billions of dollars, and humanity's greatest dream all depended on the next few minutes. The Eagle continued its descent, carrying 2 men toward a rendezvous with history. Soon, computer alarms would scream warnings, fuel would run dangerously low, and Armstrong would need to take manual control to avoid disaster. But for now, the descent had begun, and there was no turning back. Part 2. Eagle's hazardous manual landing amid computer alarms. The descent continued, but the peaceful journey suddenly turned chaotic. At 33,000 feet above the lunar surface, the Eagle's computer began screaming warnings. Sharp beeps filled the cramped cabin as yellow lights flashed on the control panel. The display showed 12:02 in bright numbers. Then, 12:01 moments later. Armstrong and Aldrin had never seen these alarm codes during training. Their hearts raced as they looked at each other through their helmet visors. The computer was supposed to guide them safely to the surface, but now it seemed to be failing at the worst possible moment. "Give us a reading on the 12:02 program alarm," Armstrong radioed to Houston, his voice steady despite the crisis. Back on Earth, flight controllers frantically flipped through thick manuals, searching for answers. 26-year-old guidance officer Steve Bales had studied these obscure errors just weeks earlier. He quickly realized the computer wasn't broken. It was simply overloaded with too many tasks. "We're go on that alarm," Houston finally replied. The computer was prioritizing the most important job, landing the spacecraft. Everything else could wait. But the delays had pushed the Eagle off course. Instead of heading toward the smooth landing site they had practiced for, the computer was steering them toward a field of massive boulders. Armstrong peered through the small window and saw rocks the size of cars scattered below. Landing there would mean certain death. With fuel running low and alarms still blaring, he made a split-second decision. He switched off the automatic pilot and took manual control. His hands gripped the controls as he flew the Eagle like a helicopter, searching for a safe spot. Aldrin called out altitude and speed readings while monitoring their rapidly dropping fuel supply. 30 seconds, came the warning from Houston. They had 30 seconds of fuel left before they would have to abort the landing or crash. The lunar surface rushed up toward them. Dust began swirling beneath the engine, creating a gray cloud that made it hard to see. Armstrong's training took over as he carefully moved the spacecraft forward, looking for smooth ground. The fuel gauge showed almost empty. "Contact light," Aldrin announced as a probe touched the surface. Armstrong shut off the engine. The Eagle dropped the final 3 feet and landed with a gentle thud. For a moment, complete silence filled the cabin. They had made it, with less than 20 seconds of fuel remaining. The most dangerous part of humanity's greatest adventure was over. The Eagle sat safely on the moon's surface, ready to make history. Part 3. Touchdown at Tranquility Base. The Eagle has landed. The dust swirled up like a great curtain around the Eagle as Armstrong fought to find solid ground in those final seconds. Through the haze, patches of the lunar surface became visible. Flat areas mixed with rocks and small craters. The computer alarms had stopped, but their echo remained fresh in both men's minds as they watched the fuel gauge hover dangerously close to empty. Armstrong's hands stayed steady on the controls as he nudged the spacecraft forward, searching for the smoothest spot he could find. Aldrin called out altitude readings in a calm voice that masked the tension both men felt. 20 seconds of fuel. 15. 10. The surface rushed toward them, no longer an abstract destination, but real ground that would either welcome them or destroy them. Contact light, Aldrin announced as one of the Eagle's footpads touched down. Armstrong immediately cut the engine. The spacecraft dropped the final 3 feet and settled with a solid thud that vibrated through the cabin. Then came silence, complete, overwhelming silence that neither man had ever experienced. For a heartbeat, Armstrong and Aldrin simply stared at each other. They had done it. After 8 years of preparation, 3 days of travel, and the most nerve-wracking descent in human history, they sat safely on the moon's surface. Armstrong's voice broke the silence with words that would echo through history. "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." The response from Mission Control exploded with barely contained joy. Controllers who had maintained professional calm through every crisis finally let their emotions show. Charlie Duke's voice crackled back. "Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot." In the cabin, Armstrong and Aldrin began the careful process of shutting down systems and running through post-landing checklists. Each switch position and reading had to be confirmed and logged. But between the technical tasks, both men found themselves stealing glances through the small windows at the world outside. The lunar landscape stretched before them in stark black and white. No atmosphere softened the harsh shadows or muted the brilliant sunlight. Hills rolled toward the horizon, under a sky so black it seemed to absorb light itself. This was not Earth, not even close. The silence felt absolute, broken only by the hum of life support systems and the occasional radio transmission from Houston. Armstrong and Aldrin had trained for years to reach this moment, but nothing could have prepared them for the reality of sitting on another world. They were farther from home than any human had ever been, surrounded by a landscape that had remained unchanged for billions of years. The weight of what they had accomplished began to settle over them alongside the realization of what still lay ahead. The Eagle had landed, but their mission had only just begun. Outside their small metal capsule lay the surface of the moon, waiting for the first human footsteps. Part 4. Armstrong and Aldrin suit up for humanity's first moonwalk. Inside the cramped lunar module, Armstrong and Aldrin faced their most daunting task yet. The successful landing had been only the beginning. Now, they had to transform themselves from spaceship pilots into moonwalkers, a process that would test every aspect of their training and equipment. The Eagle's cabin, barely larger than a telephone booth, suddenly felt even smaller as they began the complex ritual of suiting up. Their bulky white spacesuits hung like empty shells around the module's walls. Each suit weighed over 180 pounds on Earth, though here on the moon, they would feel much lighter. Still, maneuvering within the confined space proved challenging as they helped each other into the thick, pressurized garments. Armstrong surprised Mission Control by requesting to move ahead of schedule. The original plan called for a rest period, but both astronauts felt too energized to sleep. They had just accomplished the impossible, and the moon's surface beckoned just beyond their thin metal walls. Houston agreed to the earlier timeline, understanding the moment's historic weight. Aldrin methodically worked through each system check. He tested the portable life support backpacks that would keep them alive outside, verified radio communications, and double-checked every connection. These bulky backpacks contained everything necessary for survival: oxygen, power, cooling water, and carbon dioxide scrubbers. A single malfunction could prove fatal on the airless lunar surface. The process of depressurizing the cabin created its own drama. They had to slowly release all the air from their temporary home, making the Eagle's atmosphere match the vacuum outside. This gradual process prevented the hatch from being blown open by pressure differences, but it also meant crossing a threshold from which there was no quick return. As they prepared, both men felt the weight of history pressing upon them. Every human who had ever gazed at the moon and wondered about walking on its surface had led to this moment. Ancient dreamers, science fiction writers, rocket pioneers, and the thousands of engineers and technicians who had made Apollo possible were all represented in these final preparations. The communication systems crackled with voices from Houston, offering technical guidance and moral support. But the astronauts also worked in periods of focused silence, each lost in private thoughts about what lay ahead. They were about to step into a realm that no earthly experience could have prepared them for. Outside their small sanctuary, the Sea of Tranquility stretched in all directions under the black sky. No wind stirred the ancient dust. No sound existed in the vacuum. The only motion came from Earth, hanging like a blue jewel in the star-filled darkness above them. Armstrong positioned himself near the hatch, ready to make humanity's first steps onto another world. The moment had arrived to transform centuries of dreams into reality. Chapter 4. The First Moonwalk. A Giant Leap. Part 1. Armstrong's First Steps and Iconic Words. At exactly 10:56 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong stood at the bottom of the Eagle's ladder, his boots touching the powdery gray surface of the moon. The world held its breath. Through crackling radio transmissions, millions heard his now famous words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." The moment felt both monumental and strangely quiet. Armstrong moved carefully, testing each step in the moon's weak gravity. His movements looked clumsy and bouncing, like a child learning to walk. The fine lunar dust kicked up with each step, clinging to his white spacesuit. He described what he saw to Mission Control back on Earth: a barren, crater-filled landscape stretching endlessly under the black sky. Armstrong knew time was precious. If something went wrong, they might need to leave quickly. So he immediately began collecting rock and soil samples, scooping them into a bag attached to his suit. His hands moved steadily despite the bulky gloves. Every action was deliberate and calm, even though his heart was surely racing. Back on Earth, the scene was electric. In Houston's Mission Control, engineers and scientists erupted in cheers. Around the globe, families crowded around television sets, watching the grainy black and white images of a human walking on another world. Children stayed up past bedtime. Adults wept openly. For a few hours, the troubles of 1969 seemed to fade as humanity witnessed something impossible becoming real. Armstrong himself remained focused on the job. He tested the ground beneath his feet, finding it firm enough to support him and the lunar module. He moved in slow-motion hops, gradually growing more confident. The alien landscape fascinated him. No wind had ever blown here. No rain had ever fallen. The footprints he was making would last for millions of years. In Mission Control, Flight Director Gene Kranz watched every move through the fuzzy television feed. The engineers had trained for this moment for years, but seeing it actually happen felt surreal. They monitored Armstrong's life support systems, oxygen levels, and heart rate. Everything looked good. Armstrong worked methodically, knowing that Buzz Aldrin would join him soon. He photographed the lunar module and the surrounding area. He tested his ability to move rocks and pick up samples. Each task revealed something new about this alien world. The weight of history pressed down on him, but Armstrong carried it gracefully. He knew that someday, people would remember exactly where they were when they watched this moment. He was no longer just Neil Armstrong. Test pilot from Ohio. He had become the first human to walk on the moon, forever linking his name with this achievement that represented the best of human courage and curiosity. Part 2. Aldrin joins and together they explore the lunar surface. The lunar module's hatch opened again 19 minutes after Armstrong's first steps. Buzz Aldrin's white suit emerged from the shadows, his movements deliberate and careful as he descended the ladder. He paused at the bottom step, taking in the stark landscape that stretched before him. His first words captured what millions would feel when they saw the images. Beautiful view. Beautiful. Magnificent desolation. The phrase would echo through history books and documentaries for decades. In just 2 words, Aldrin had perfectly described this alien world. It was breathtakingly beautiful, yet completely lifeless. No wind stirred the dust. No birds flew overhead. The silence was absolute except for the voices crackling through their radios. Armstrong watched his crewmate adapt to the strange environment. Both men began moving with the peculiar bouncing gait that 1/6 gravity demanded. Their first steps were tentative, almost clumsy. They lifted their feet high and landed softly, like children learning to walk again. Within minutes, they discovered they could move efficiently with a gentle hopping motion that looked almost playful to viewers on Earth. The 2 astronauts had just over 2 hours to complete their checklist. Every minute mattered. Their oxygen supply was limited, and the risks were enormous. A torn suit or a serious fall could end everything instantly. Yet they worked with remarkable calm, constantly talking to each other and to mission control in Houston. Armstrong focused on photography and sample collection, while Aldrin tested their ability to move around the landing site. They described everything they saw in detail. The soil was fine and powdery, but packed down under their boots. Strange rocks lay scattered across the surface. The horizon seemed closer than expected, curving away dramatically due to the moon's smaller size. Mission Control listened intently to every word. Back on Earth, hundreds of millions of people watched grainy black and white images of 2 figures moving across a gray landscape. The picture quality was poor, but the moment was crystal clear. Humans were walking on another world. The astronauts worked as a seamless team. When one collected samples, the other took photographs. They warned each other about cables and obstacles. They shared observations and helped each other with equipment. Their training had prepared them well, but nothing could have prepared them for the emotional weight of the moment. The American flag waited in the lunar module's storage compartment. Soon they would plant it in the lunar soil, creating one of history's most recognizable images. But first, they needed to master this strange new world where every step was a calculated risk and every breath counted toward their safe return home. Part 3. Scientific experiments, flag planting, and historic Plaque. The 2 astronauts had work to do beyond simply walking on another world. They carried with them carefully planned scientific instruments that would transform their brief visit into a treasure trove of data. Armstrong moved methodically toward the lunar module's equipment bay, retrieving the first of several experiments that scientists back on Earth had waited years to deploy. The solar wind collector came first, a simple but elegant device designed to capture particles streaming from the sun. Armstrong planted the aluminum foil sheet on a pole, where it would silently gather evidence of the solar wind's composition. This quiet experiment would reveal secrets about our star that no Earth-based instrument could detect through our planet's protective magnetic field. Next came the seismometer, a sensitive instrument meant to detect moonquakes and meteor impacts. Aldrin carefully positioned the device, knowing that scientists hoped to peer inside the moon itself through the vibrations it would record. The laser reflector followed, a precise array of mirrors that would bounce laser beams fired from Earth back to their source. This simple but ingenious device would help measure the exact distance between Earth and Moon for decades to come. As they worked, both men discovered that the lunar surface presented unexpected challenges. The soil was harder than anticipated, and the fine dust clung to everything with surprising tenacity. When they attempted to plant the American flag, the ground resisted their efforts. The flagpole proved difficult to drive deep enough into the compressed lunar material. Despite their struggles, they managed to raise the flag, though it remained precariously positioned. The image of the stars and stripes against the black lunar sky became instantly iconic, broadcast live to hundreds of millions of viewers on Earth. Yet both astronauts understood this symbol represented far more than national achievement. Armstrong read aloud the words engraved on a plaque. Part 4. Return to Eagle after over 2 hours on the moon. With their scientific work nearly finished, Armstrong and Aldrin began their final moments on the moon's surface. Their oxygen supplies were running lower with each passing minute, and Mission Control in Houston kept a careful watch on their life support systems. The two astronauts moved with purpose, gathering the last rock samples and taking final photographs of this strange world they had briefly called home. The radio crackled with instructions from Earth. Time was running short. Armstrong carefully sealed the sample containers, while Aldrin took one last look at the barren landscape stretching to the horizon. The silence around them was complete, broken only by their breathing and radio communications. No wind stirred the dust at their feet. No birds flew overhead. They stood in a place where no life had ever existed. Mission Control gave the word. It was time to return to the Eagle. Armstrong climbed the ladder first, each rung bringing him closer to the cramped safety of their lunar module. Aldrin followed, pausing to brush lunar dust from his suit. They had learned that this fine, powdery dust clung to everything and could damage their equipment. Every precaution mattered when survival depended on machines working perfectly. Inside the Eagle, new challenges awaited them. The small cabin felt even more cramped with their bulky spacesuits and the precious cargo of moon rocks. They struggled to remove their helmets and gloves in the confined space. Their hands shook slightly, whether from exhaustion or the magnitude of what they had accomplished, neither man could say. Armstrong carefully stowed the sample containers, while Aldrin dealt with their life support equipment. Every item had to be secured for the journey ahead. One loose object could become dangerous during launch. Their movements were slow and deliberate, despite their fatigue. They had trained for this moment countless times, but the reality felt different from any simulation. Through the small window, they could see the footprints they had left in the dust. Those marks would remain there for millions of years, long after everyone who witnessed this day had been forgotten. The thought was both humbling and amazing, but their mission was far from over. The most dangerous part still lay ahead. They had to fire their engines at exactly the right moment to lift off from the moon's surface. They had to find and dock with Michael Collins, who was orbiting alone above them. One mistake could strand them forever on this lifeless world. As they prepared for rest before launch, both men felt the weight of history. They had done something no human had ever done before, yet they also felt small and fragile in the vast emptiness of space, completely dependent on their machines and the people back on Earth who watched over them. Chapter 5, Return and Lasting Legacy, Part 1, Ascent from the Moon and Reunion with Michael Collins. After 21 hours on the lunar surface, the time had come for the most dangerous part of the entire mission. Armstrong and Aldrin faced a terrifying reality. Their lunar module's ascent stage had never been tested in the moon's weak gravity and vacuum. If the engine failed to ignite, they would be stranded forever, with no rescue possible. The two astronauts completed their final checks with methodical precision. Every switch, every gauge, every connection had to be perfect. They knew that unlike every other phase of Apollo 11, this moment offered no backup plan. The Ascent stage engine was their only ticket home. At 1:54 p.m. Houston time on July 21st, Armstrong's voice crackled across space. The Eagle has wings. The engine had fired successfully, lifting them away from Tranquility Base in a shower of lunar dust and debris. Behind them, they left an American flag, scientific equipment, and humanity's first footprints on another world. The ascent proved harrowing. The lightweight lunar module shuddered and vibrated as it climbed through the moon's airless sky. Armstrong and Aldrin could feel every bump and shake, knowing their fragile craft was all that stood between them and the void. The engine burned for exactly 7 minutes, propelling them into lunar orbit where Michael Collins waited in Columbia. Collins had spent those long hours circling the moon alone, maintaining radio contact and preparing for the rendezvous. He had experienced perhaps the loneliest moments in human history, passing over the far side of the moon with no communication possible with Earth or his crewmates. Now, watching for the ascending eagle through his telescope, Collins felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. The docking procedure demanded extraordinary skill. Collins had to maneuver Columbia with perfect timing to intercept Eagle's orbit. The two spacecraft, traveling at thousands of miles per hour, had only a narrow window to connect. Any miscalculation would send one or both vehicles spiraling away from each other. When the docking mechanisms finally clicked together with a satisfying thud, all three astronauts exhaled deeply. They were reunited, but their work was far from over. Armstrong and Aldrin carefully transferred their precious lunar samples and film canisters through the connecting tunnel. These rock specimens and photographs would provide scientists with their first direct evidence of the moon's composition and history. The crew spent the next few hours sharing their experiences and preparing Eagle for abandonment. They would jettison the lunar module, leaving it to crash into the moon's surface. Columbia alone would carry them home to Earth, loaded with 22 kilograms of lunar material and 3 exhausted but triumphant explorers ready to begin their journey back to humanity. Part 2. The journey back to Earth with safe splashdown. With Eagle now discarded and crashing silently into the lunar surface, the 3 astronauts faced their most crucial challenge yet: getting home alive. The journey back to Earth required perfect timing and flawless execution. One wrong calculation could send Columbia careening past Earth into the vast emptiness of space. Collins fired the service module engine for the trans-Earth injection burn, a maneuver that would break them free from lunar orbit. The engine had to work perfectly. There were no second chances. Mission Control monitored every second as the spacecraft accelerated to over 24,000 miles per hour, the speed needed to reach Earth in 3 days. During the long journey home, the astronauts settled into routines that felt both familiar and strange. They ate, slept, and performed system checks while Earth gradually grew from a tiny blue dot to a magnificent sphere filling their windows. Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins took turns monitoring instruments and communicating with Houston. The excitement of their achievement mixed with bone-deep exhaustion from days of intense concentration. As Earth loomed larger each hour, nervous energy built inside the cramped cabin. The men knew that re-entry would test their heat shield in ways no ground simulation could replicate. At 25,000 miles per hour, Columbia would slam into Earth's atmosphere like a meteor. The heat shield had to work perfectly, or they would burn up in seconds. On July 24, 1969, Columbia began its fiery plunge toward the Pacific Ocean. The spacecraft glowed white-hot as it tore through the atmosphere, trailing a brilliant streak across the dawn sky. For 6 terrifying minutes, the heat created a cocoon of ionized gas around the capsule that blocked all radio contact with Mission Control. Houston waited in tense silence. Had the heat shield held? Were the astronauts alive? Then, crackling through the static, came Collins' voice. "We're doing great." Relief flooded Mission Control as 3 orange and white parachutes blossomed above Columbia, slowing its descent to a gentle 24 miles per hour. At 12:50 p.m. Eastern Time, Columbia splashed into the warm Pacific waters near the USS Hornet. Navy divers immediately surrounded the bobbing capsule, securing it with flotation devices. The astronauts had survived their quarter-million-mile journey. When the capsule hatch opened, Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins emerged as the first humans ever to return from another world. But their homecoming was bittersweet. Despite their triumph, scientists worried about unknown lunar germs. The three heroes were immediately sealed into a mobile quarantine facility, where they would spend the next 3 weeks isolated from their families and the cheering world that awaited their story. Part 3. The global reaction, Apollo 11's impact on humanity. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours of Columbia's splashdown, television broadcasts carried the triumph to every corner of the globe. In London, crowds gathered in Trafalgar Square to watch the giant screens. In Tokyo, families huddled around radios in the early morning hours. Even in Moscow, where state media had downplayed American achievements, citizens whispered excitedly about the moon landing. President Nixon declared the astronauts' return a victory for all mankind, while leaders from dozens of nations sent congratulations. Prime Minister Harold Wilson called it humanity's greatest adventure. French President Charles de Gaulle, typically critical of American ventures, praised the achievement as magnificent. The Vatican's newspaper ran headlines celebrating human ingenuity reaching toward the heavens. But the real celebration waited until the astronauts emerged from quarantine. On August 13th, New York City erupted in the largest ticker tape parade since World War II ended. 4 million people lined the streets as Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins rode through Manhattan in open cars, paper cascading like snow from office windows. The three men waved and smiled, still processing their transformation from test pilots into global icons. The world tour that followed was extraordinary. In 24 countries across 6 continents, the astronauts met presidents, prime ministers, and kings. In Mexico City, 1 million people filled the streets. In Paris, crowds sang the American national anthem. Children everywhere pressed forward just to touch the men who had walked on another world. Yet something deeper was happening beyond the celebrations. The photographs the crew brought back changed how humanity saw itself. The image of Earth rising over the lunar horizon showed our planet as a small blue marble suspended in black space. No borders were visible from that distance. No armies or politics could be seen. Just one fragile world, the only home humans had ever known. Scientists around the globe studied the lunar samples with wonder. The ancient rocks told stories spanning billions of years, revealing secrets about how planets formed and evolved. Laboratories in multiple countries analyzed the moon dust, each discovery adding pieces to the puzzle of our cosmic origins. Children gazed at the night sky with new eyes. Applications to engineering schools soared. Young people who had watched the landing on fuzzy television screens decided they too would reach for the stars. The mission proved that the impossible could become possible, with enough determination and skill. Even former rivals acknowledged the achievement's significance. Soviet scientists, despite their government's space race competition, privately celebrated the technical mastery Apollo 11 represented. The mission had transcended national boundaries to become a human milestone. As the initial excitement settled into lasting memory, Apollo 11's true impact became clear. It had given humanity a new story about itself, not as earthbound creatures limited by gravity and doubt, but as explorers capable of reaching across the vast darkness to touch new worlds. Part 4. Apollo 11's Enduring Legacy. Inspiration, Science, and Space Exploration. The afterglow of Apollo 11's triumph would prove far more lasting than anyone expected. While the parades ended and the headlines faded, the mission's true power began to emerge in ways both practical and profound. The technologies born from the lunar program quietly revolutionized daily life. The miniaturized computers that guided Apollo now live in our pockets as smartphones. Heat shields developed for re-entry protect firefighters and race car drivers. Water purification systems designed for astronauts now clean drinking water in remote villages. Memory foam created to cushion astronauts during launch comforts patients in hospital beds. These innovations spread like ripples across decades, touching lives that would never know their lunar origins. Scientists found treasures in the lunar samples that exceeded all expectations. The 842 pounds of moon rocks revealed Earth's violent birth when a Mars-sized object slammed into our young planet and sent molten debris spinning into orbit. This cosmic collision theory, confirmed by lunar chemistry, rewrote textbooks about planetary formation. The samples also proved the moon bone dry, crushing hopes of water but opening new questions about how planets acquire their atmospheres. More powerful than any technology was Apollo's effect on human imagination. Children who watched Armstrong's first steps became the engineers who built the International Space Station. Students, inspired by Mission Control's diversity, broke barriers in science and engineering. The famous Earth photo taken from lunar orbit sparked environmental movements, showing our blue marble floating alone in the black void. Yet Apollo also left troubling questions. The program cost $25 billion at a time when poverty plagued American cities. Critics argued the money could have solved earthly problems rather than planting flags on distant worlds. After 6 lunar landings, public interest waned as quickly as it had peaked. The final 3 Apollo missions were canceled, and humans have not returned to the moon since 1972. This tension between achievement and cost haunts space exploration today. Mars beckons as the next great destination, but missions there will demand even greater resources and patience. Private companies now lead where governments once pioneered, bringing both innovation and profit motives to the cosmos. Armstrong's footprint in lunar dust remains undisturbed after half a century, preserved in the airless silence. That single step symbolizes humanity's finest hour, when political rivals set aside differences to attempt the impossible. The mission proved that cooperation and determination could overcome any barrier. Today's challenges seem as daunting as reaching the moon once did. Climate change, pandemics, and inequality test our resolve. Yet Apollo reminds us that humans can achieve miracles when united by common purpose. The mission's greatest legacy may be the simple but revolutionary idea that no dream is too ambitious for our species to attempt.